The first time he realized his life was not really his, he was standing in a grocery store parking lot, staring at the cracked reflection in his car window and wondering when exactly he had surrendered control without even noticing. The cheap sedan, dented on the right side and haunted by a stale smell no air freshener could erase, looked like a perfect metaphor for him. Still running technically, but tired in ways no one could see from a distance. His fingers tightened on the cold metal door handle, knuckles white. Though he could not explain why, it was just another evening. Just another stop after another day at a job that drained him drop by drop. Yet his chest felt heavy, full of invisible stones. Around him, the world moved in careless motion. Carts rattled across the asphalt. Engines coughed and roared to life. A baby cried near the entrance, the sound sharp and raw enough to cut through the hum of traffic. People came and went with purpose, holding bags, laughing into phones, unlocking doors to lives that at least looked like their own. He alone felt like a ghost pacing through somebody else's routine. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his mother appeared on the screen, her words painfully familiar, like a line from a script they had rehearsed for years. "Did you ask your manager about the promotion? You deserve it." He stared at the text until the letters blurred. Deserve. Such a hopeful word, soft and shiny and fragile. He wanted to believe it. He always had. But believing it meant acting on it. And acting meant facing the possibility that other people did not agree. He slipped the phone back into his pocket without replying and walked toward the automatic doors. They hissed open on cue, welcoming him into the pale, humming light. Inside, the store looked exactly as it always did. Aisles straight and endless. Shelves packed with too many choices he never really made. Everything labeled, measured, sorted, while his life remained an unmarked box in some forgotten corner. He pushed his cart slowly, moving in that numb, familiar way that felt more like drifting than walking. In the bread aisle, he reached for a loaf and accidentally grabbed two. For several strange seconds he just stood there, a grown man frozen by the smallest decision. White, wheat, 1, 2. It should not have mattered. It did not matter. Yet his chest tightened as if he were standing at the edge of something enormous. A hot flush crawled up his neck. Finally, he put both loaves back and walked away with empty hands. At the self-checkout, he noticed a small boy tugging on his father's sleeve while pointing at a pack of gum stacked near the register. The boy did not ask politely or silently weigh the pros and cons. He just tugged and pointed, eyes bright, want written all over his face. The father grabbed the gum without hesitation and tossed it onto the pile of groceries. No debate, no apology, no explanation. The boy wanted. The father acted. That was it. The simplicity of the exchange hit him harder than it should have. When had wanting become so complicated for him? When had every desire turned into a courtroom where he had to argue for the right to exist? He paid, bagged his things, and walked back into the evening. The sky was bruised purple and gray, the air sharp with the kind of cold that made his lungs ache. He unlocked his car but did not get inside. He just stood there, staring over the roof at nothing and everything, feeling like someone standing at the edge of a cliff they never meant to approach. A thought slid quietly into his mind. Maybe, he realized, his life had not been stolen from him. Maybe he had given it away piece by piece, every time he waited for permission instead of choosing himself. The idea made his stomach knot. He finally opened the door, tossed the groceries onto the passenger seat, and sat in the driver's seat without turning on the engine. The silence inside the car felt thick, almost alive. He rested his forehead on the steering wheel and whispered, "You are doing it again." Waiting in the parking lot, waiting to move, waiting to live. He slammed his fist lightly against the steering wheel, not out of anger, but out of a dull, tired desperation that had nowhere else to go. After a few long breaths, he started the engine and drove home with the window cracked, letting the cold air sting his face like a punishment and maybe a prayer. The road rolled past in blurred streaks of light and shadow, houses and buildings slipping by like other people's choices. His apartment greeted him with the same dim emptiness as always, lit by a weak glow from the street lamp outside. He set the groceries on the counter and leaned on his hands, palms pressed hard into the cool fake stone. For a moment he just listened to the quiet, feeling it settle over him like dust. Then there was a knock at the door, soft. 2 short taps, then one longer, as if whoever stood outside was nervous about intruding. He frowned. No one came to see him unannounced. No one really came to see him at all. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty. Only an envelope was taped to the frame at eye level, the paper shivering slightly in the draft that snuck through the stairwell. He peeled it free and stepped back inside, locking the door before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of plain white paper folded once. There were no logos, no printed headers, no return address. Just handwriting, neat and dark, marching across the center of the page in one steady line. Your life is shrinking every year you refuse to live it. Stop waiting for permission to win. His throat went dry. He read the sentence again, then again. The room seemed to tilt very slightly, like he was standing on a ship that had just shifted course. Who had written this? Who knew him well enough to send something like this, but not well enough to sign their name? He checked the back of the page, half expecting another message. Nothing. The paper shook between his fingers. His heart hammered so loudly he could feel the pulse in his ears. He walked back to the door, yanked it open, and peered down the hallway. It was completely empty, the only sound a faint television muffled behind a neighbor's wall. He called out a quiet, uncertain hello that sounded foolish as soon as it left his mouth. No one answered. He shut the door more gently this time, as if slamming it might break the thin, strange spell that had fallen over the night. In the living room, he sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, the note still in his hand. He read it once more, tasting every word like something sharp. Your life is shrinking every year you refuse to live it. Stop waiting for permission to win. It was not polite advice. It was not gentle encouragement. It was an accusation carved into a command. Something inside him reacted, flinched, bristled. Another part of him leaned toward it, hungry, because even if he did not know who wrote it, he knew they were right. He could feel it in the sore, empty places he tried so hard to ignore. Years unrolled in his mind like film. Times he wanted to speak but stayed quiet. Chances he wanted to take but delayed until they evaporated. Opportunities he watched other people seize while he stood at the edge, convincing himself he was being patient, reasonable, realistic. He saw himself at 20, filling notebooks with stories and promising that one day he would share them. He saw himself at 25, scrolling through calls for submissions and closing the tabs before finishing the guidelines, because the possibility of rejection made his throat close. He saw himself at 28, nodding while his boss praised him for being reliable, steady, someone who never made waves. That praise had felt like a compliment, and a funeral folded into one. He lowered the note and stared at the dark television screen opposite him, his reflection faint and warped on the black glass. "Stop waiting for permission to win," he whispered, trying the words out loud. The sentence landed differently when it came from his own mouth. The air in the room seemed to shift, pressured from the inside. He did not move for a long time. The evening stretched thin and quiet around him. The letter lay on the table now, a small, harmless-looking thing that had somehow put his entire life on trial. After a while, he stood and walked to the small desk pushed against the wall. Dust clung to the corners of his unused notebooks. His old laptop sat closed, cold, the power cord coiled beside it like a forgotten lifeline. He hesitated, then opened it. The screen flickered awake reluctantly, bathing his face in pale light. folders loaded one by one. Among them were documents he had not opened in years. He clicked on a file with a name he barely remembered choosing. Text filled the screen. His text. A story he had once believed might matter. He began to read. The words pulled him in quickly, far faster than the spreadsheets and emails and reports that had dictated his days for so long. He saw scenes, felt the rhythm, recognized traces of a younger version of himself who had dared to care deeply about something. When he reached the end of the draft, his eyes burned. He did not know whether from shame or grief or an odd, fragile pride. "I want this." He breathed into the quiet, barely loud enough to hear himself. Not the story specifically, though it mattered. The life behind it. The life where he tried. The life where he risked, where he created, where his days were not measured only in safe, small tasks completed for someone else's dream. His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the spell. A reminder popped up about the weekly Monday meeting with his manager at 9 a.m. sharp. Discussion. Quarterly performance, shifting responsibilities, long-term professional growth. He stared at the notification. Long-term professional growth. The phrase felt hollow now, like a slogan stapled over a locked door. Instead of tapping OK, he let the screen go dark. He shut the laptop with a softness that felt almost ceremonial and remained standing for several seconds, listening to his own breathing. Something had shifted. It was not a dramatic transformation. The room still looked the same old couch, the same chipped coffee table, the same tired plant wilting in the corner. But inside there was a subtle reordering, as if someone had walked into the control room of his mind and nudged one lever out of its stuck position. He walked to the table, picked up the note, and read it one final time that night. Then he slid it into his wallet, behind his ID, as if it were a new kind of identification. Not who he had been, but who he might still decide to become. Dawn crept slowly into the sky, thin light seeping through the blinds. He had not really slept, though he had lay down for an hour or two, eyes open, mind spinning. When he finally stepped outside, the morning air wrapped around him, chilly and fresh. He locked the apartment door and did something he could not remember doing willingly in years. He paused, not to delay, not to doubt, to choose. The thought arrived simple and clear. No one was coming to hand him a better life. No supervisor, no friend, no mysterious stranger with a golden opportunity. No piece of paper, not even the one in his wallet, could do the work for him. The letter had not granted him permission. It had exposed the lie that he needed it. He took a breath that felt like inhaling the beginning of a storm and whispered, just for himself, "Stop waiting for permission to win." The world did not tremble. No audience applauded. No music swelled. A bus rumbled by. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a car alarm chirped twice and stopped. Everything remained ordinary, yet his first step down the stairs felt different from every other step he had taken before. It felt chosen. It felt like the smallest, quietest rebellion against a lifetime of hesitation. The road ahead was still uncertain, still crowded with fear and habit and the possibility of failure, but for the first time, he was walking it knowing that waiting had been the most dangerous failure of all. And as he moved forward into the day, he carried with him a promise he had never truly made until that moment, a promise not to the world, not to his mother, not to any invisible judge, but to himself. He would no longer live like a guest in his own life. He did not know exactly what winning would look like yet. It might not mean money or titles or the kind of polished success that impress people at reunions. Maybe it would mean finishing one story and sending it, even if someone rejected it with a form letter. Maybe it would mean sitting down every morning for an hour before work, fingers on the keyboard instead of scrolling through other people's lives on his phone. Maybe it would mean asking for the promotion at his job not because he loved the work, but because he was done silently accepting less than he gave. He pictured small scenes from a future that did not exist yet. A page filled with new words, an email sent instead of saved in drafts, his own name printed on something he had created. None of it was guaranteed, none of it was safe, but it all felt more honest than another year spent shrinking. As he walked, he noticed details he usually missed. The cracked line in the sidewalk that looked like a tiny lightning bolt, the faded flyer for a local open mic night stapled to the community board by the bus stop, the way the sun caught the edges of the clouds and set them glowing. Ordinary things, but they made him think of possibility in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. He realized that for most of his life he had been waiting for certainty before taking any step. Now, for the first time, he was willing to move with only a direction and a stubborn, fragile hope. Maybe that was what winning really started as, a quiet decision made when no one else was watching. A decision to stop asking the world for permission to become who you already knew you could be. He woke before his alarm. The sky still a muted gray outside his window, a color caught between night and morning. And for several long seconds he simply lay there, listening to the faint hum of the radiator and the distant rumble of early traffic, trying to understand why he felt different, why his chest carried a restless ache instead of the usual numb heaviness that greeted him every morning. Then the memory of the letter surfaced, sharp and electric, as though someone had reached into the darkness and traced the words across his skin. Stop waiting for permission to win. The thought made his pulse thrum harder, stirring something he had forgotten he possessed, something dangerously close to resolve. He sat up slowly, feet touching the cold floor, and let the moment settle into his bones. He didn't feel confident, not even brave, but he felt awake in a way he hadn't felt in years, as if his mind had finally stepped out of the fog he'd been wandering through. He moved through the apartment in silence, brushing his teeth, splashing water on his face, watching tiny droplets slide down the mirror like markers of a countdown he didn't fully understand. Part of him expected the feeling to vanish, this thin thread of determination winding through his chest, but it didn't. It hovered behind his ribs, quiet but steady, a reminder of the sentence tucked inside his wallet. When he pulled the wallet from his jacket and opened it, the letter peeked out like a truth refusing to be ignored. He unfolded it, rereading the sentence that had struck him like an accusation the night before, and felt the same jolt, fear tangled with something almost hopeful. The world outside was just beginning to wake when he stepped onto the sidewalk. The air was cold enough to bite the tip of his nose, and the sky had the washed-out look of an unfinished painting. Cars rolled past with headlights still on. A jogger crossed the street, breath visible in short, determined bursts. He wrapped his jacket tighter around himself and walked toward the bus stop, each step echoing the strange new awareness beneath his skin. The cracks in the pavement, the buzz of distant traffic, even the sharpness of the cold felt different, as though the world had not changed, but he had shifted in relation to it. At the bus stop, the same familiar figures gathered. The elderly woman with the floral scarf wrapped 3 times around her neck. The office worker glued to his tablet. The man who always smelled faintly of cigarettes and coffee. No one acknowledged him, of course, but for the first time he didn't feel invisible. He felt like a spectator stepping onto a stage he had spent years watching from backstage. When the bus arrived, he sat near the window, watching the city roll past in blurred strokes of gray and early morning gold. All the mornings he had wasted complaining silently about the commute, the crowds. The monotony felt farther away now, like bad memories from another life. Today the bus felt like something else entirely, a vessel carrying him toward a life he might finally decide to claim. The office greeted him with its usual assault of flickering fluorescent lights, humming printers and hurried footsteps. People rushed past him clutching coffee cups and folders, faces set in practice masks of fatigue and obligation. He moved toward his cubicle, but instead of shrinking into it like a safe shell, he felt something inside him sit a little straighter. His computer whirred to life, emails flooding in like they always did. His manager, a man with loud enthusiasm and selective hearing, passed by and clapped him on the shoulder with fake cheer. "Morning! Don't forget our meeting in an hour. Big stuff today." The old version of himself would have nodded nervously, heart sinking at the thought of another conversation where he said everything expected and nothing true. But today, the letter pressed lightly against his back pocket, as if reminding him of the promise he had whispered to himself. An hour later, he sat across from his manager in a conference room that smelled faintly of dry erase markers and stale coffee. His manager clicked through slides about productivity, department goals, shifting responsibilities, words he had heard so often they barely registered anymore, but today he wasn't drifting, he was listening. And the more he listened, the more a familiar frustration stirred how often he had been told he was indispensable, reliable, steady, yet left in the same position year after year. Then came the line he dreaded. "You've been one of our most reliable people. We're considering shifting some responsibilities around." The same vague promise, the same empty rearranging of duties without actual advancement. His fingers curled around the edge of the table. His heartbeat quickened. The old fear rose, the fear of speaking up, of stepping into the spotlight he'd avoided all his life. But the sentence echoed again in his mind, almost like a voice behind his ear. Stop waiting for permission to win. Before he could talk himself out of it, he spoke. "Actually," he said, surprising even himself, "I wanted to talk about something too." His manager blinked. He felt his throat tighten, but he pushed through it. "The promotion," he said, "I'm ready for it. I want the title, the responsibility, the step forward." Silence fell between them. His manager leaned back, studying him like a puzzle piece suddenly behaving in unexpected ways. "That's bold of you," he finally said, the word bold hitting him like a test. He held his ground. After a moment, his manager nodded. "Let me think about it. It's not a yes, but it's not a no." It wasn't victory, but it was a beginning. When he returned to his desk, the air felt lighter, or maybe he did. A coworker nodded in greeting. Another asked if he wanted to join them for lunch. Normally, he would have declined, shrinking into familiar solitude. But today he said yes. They sat together in the cafeteria talking about small, ordinary things, weather, weekend plans, office gossip. He wasn't suddenly charismatic, he wasn't transformed, but he was present, connected, alive in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be. When the workday finally ended, he stepped outside and let the cold air fill his lungs, not rushing toward the bus stop like he normally did, but walking instead toward the small park a few blocks away, drawn to the open space and the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight. Children played on rusted swings, shouting with the wild freedom he once carried effortlessly. Birds picked at crumbs near a bench where an older man sat reading. A jogger moved past with steady rhythm, earbuds in, face focused forward. He lowered himself onto an empty bench and pulled out his notebook, the same one he had carried for years as an empty promise to himself. He clicked his pen and stared at the blank page. Panic fluttered in his stomach, the old panic, the familiar voice saying he had nothing worth writing. But he ignored it. He wrote a sentence, then another, then another. The lines were shaky, uneven, but they were alive. By the time he closed the notebook, the sky had deepened into amber and lavender, and shadows stretched long across the grass. It wasn't greatness. It wasn't even good. But it was something real, something he had created rather than waited for. On the way home, he passed the small bookstore he walked by every day. Tonight, a sign taped in the window caught his eye. Local Writers' Night. This Friday. Open to all. His heart stuttered. The old version of himself would have kept walking, inventing excuses before the thought even fully formed. But tonight he stepped inside. The store smelled like ink and old wood, a comforting perfume. The woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Let me know if you need anything." He nodded, wandering through the aisles, fingertips brushing spines of books he had once dreamed of sitting beside. He bought 3. One about writing, one about courage, one about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. At home, he placed the books on his desk and sat for a long time, staring at them, trying to understand the quiet tremor moving through his chest. That night, he slept only in fragments, waking with ideas pounding behind his eyes, reaching for his notebook again and again. He wrote in the morning before work. He wrote on his lunch break. He wrote when he returned home, the pages filling more quickly now, words tumbling out before he could judge them. Fear was still there. Doubt still whispered. But the act of writing felt like a rebellion against every year he had handed to hesitation. Friday arrived too soon. He spent too much time choosing a shirt, too much time rehearsing aloud, too much time pacing the floor. He nearly talked himself out of going 3 separate times, but the letter in his wallet felt heavier tonight, as though reminding him of the promise he made not just to improve his life, but to claim it. When he reached the bookstore, his hands trembled so badly he almost pulled the door instead of pushing it. Inside, chairs were arranged in a loose semicircle. People sat with printed pages in their laps, some chatting nervously, others staring straight ahead. A woman with gray-streaked hair and bright eyes welcomed him, clipboard in hand. "Reading tonight?" He swallowed. "Yes." She wrote his name down. He sat in the 3rd row, clutching his pages so tightly they crinkled. His heart hammered against his ribs as each reader stepped up. Their voices rose and fell. The crowd laughed, sighed, nodded. His throat tightened with every passing minute. Then the woman called his name. He felt the room tilt. He stood slowly, legs trembling, and walked toward the small microphone. The faces before him blurred. The lights above him buzzed. His mouth went dry. He unfolded his pages with shaking hands, and he read. His voice cracked on the first line. It wobbled on the second, but he kept going. By the 3rd paragraph, the trembling eased. By the 4th, he lifted his gaze and saw people watching him, not with judgment, but with attention. Real, open attention. He felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been knotted for years. When he finished, silence lingered for one long, suspended second. Then applause rose, gentle, warm, real. His breath caught, his vision blurred. He stepped back, heart pounding as he returned to his seat, listening to the sound of something inside him unlocking. After the event, 2 people approached him to say they enjoyed his piece. One asked if he planned to come back next month. For the first time, he said yes without hesitation. On the walk home, the night felt different. Alive, humming, full of unseen currents. The city lights shimmered softly and his steps felt lighter, as if the ground itself had shifted under him. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded letter. It wasn't magic. It wasn't even guidance. It was a mirror reflecting the truth he had avoided. Nobody was coming to choose him. Nobody was going to tap him on the shoulder and say he was ready. If he wanted a life he could be proud of, he had to step into the fear, into the unknown, into the moments where his voice shook and his hands trembled. He looked up at the dark sky, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and whispered the words that had begun to change everything. Stop waiting for permission to win. The world stayed quiet, but inside him something roared awake. He wasn't done. He wasn't fixed. He wasn't fearless. But he was moving. And for the first time in years, he was moving toward himself. He woke Saturday with a sense of unfamiliar alertness, the kind that felt like stepping out of a long burial, his mind clearer than it had been in years, though still shadowed by old fears that clung to him like a second skin. The memory of reading his work aloud the night before drifted through him like a haunting, a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration that had left fingerprints on his thoughts even after sleep claimed him. He lay there in the half-light of morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying the applause that had washed over him, soft but real, and the warm nods from strangers who had spoken to him afterward. For so long he had believed he was invisible, irrelevant, a man whose voice didn't carry beyond the smallest circle of obligation. Yet last night he had been heard, truly heard. And the realization unsettled him almost as much as it inspired him. He pushed himself upright, feet meeting the cold floor, and felt something shift inside him again. Not as dramatic as the day he found the letter, but meaningful nonetheless, a subtle rearranging of his inner architecture. He washed his face, brushed his teeth, and caught his reflection in the mirror. He didn't look different. Not really, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something sharper, brighter, as though a pilot light had flickered back to life deep within him. Still, change didn't erase fear. As he made coffee in the quiet kitchen, doubt crept in like a familiar intruder, whispering that last night had been a fluke, that courage borrowed in one moment would not last in another. He carried his mug to the small table, sat down, and pulled his notebook toward him. The sight of the filled pages almost startled him. Proof of effort, proof of motion, proof of a version of himself he had long abandoned. He flipped to a blank page. The emptiness stared back at him, vast and demanding. His pen hesitated above it, trembling slightly. It would have been so easy to close the notebook, to tell himself he had done enough for now, that last night's small victory could be stretched and savored without risking another failure. But the letter waited in his wallet, its message flooding him with stubborn insistence. Stop waiting for permission to win. He lowered the pen to the page and began writing. The first few sentences were stiff, awkward, brittle, but soon the words loosened. Ideas formed, sentences connected. The story he had begun earlier in the week took shape with surprising clarity. He wrote for nearly an hour before pausing to stretch his fingers. When he set the pen down, he felt lighter, as though some weight had been siphoned off his chest. He could still feel fear, yes, but it no longer controlled the entire room. It lived in the corner now, watching, waiting, but no longer choking him. Later that morning, he stepped outside, needing to breathe different air, needing motion to match the momentum building inside him. The city felt softer somehow, or maybe he had simply stopped bracing against it. People passed him in waves, laughing children, tired parents, workers carrying bags of groceries, teenagers scrolling through their phones, everyone lost in their own storms, everyone fighting private battles. He watched them with new eyes, realizing how many people moved through life wanting something but never reaching for it, held back not by impossibility, but by hesitation. It made him feel less alone. He stopped at a small cafe he rarely visited and ordered a tea, choosing a seat near the window where sunlight poured across the wooden table. He pulled out his notebook again, not to write this time, but to read what he had written earlier. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was honest, and it was his. As he flipped through the older pages, he noticed how tentative his early lines were compared to the ones he had written after the bookstore reading. Growth wasn't loud, it whispered, but it was there. The cafe filled slowly around him, conversations melting together into a low hum. A couple nearby argued quietly over weekend plans. A man in a suit tapped aggressively at his laptop. Two teens snapped pictures of their pastries. Life unfolded in small, chaotic ways, and he suddenly understood something that felt both obvious and profound. People were messy, flawed, learning as they went. He didn't need to be perfect to move forward. He just needed to move. After leaving the cafe, he wandered into a part of town he rarely explored. Buildings grew older here, bricks worn and weathered, windows clouded with age. He found himself stopping in front of a narrow shop with a faded sign that read Avery's Antique Books. The name meant nothing to him, yet he felt drawn inside. A bell chimed softly when he pushed the door open. The interior smelled of dust and history, the air thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Rows of tall shelves formed narrow aisles, crowded with books whose spines had been touched by countless hands over the decades. An elderly man lifted his head from behind the counter, wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. "Welcome," he said, voice warm but distant, as if accustomed to solitude. "Let me know if you need help finding anything." He nodded politely and drifted through the aisles, fingertips brushing the textured edges of antique volumes. Titles whispered to him. Collections of forgotten poetry, journals written by unknown authors, memoirs of lives he'd never lived. Something about the place comforted him. A sanctuary built from stories that had survived long after their writers had grown old or vanished. At the far end of the shop, tucked on a low shelf, he found a small leather-bound book without a title on the cover. He picked it up. The leather was cracked, soft, worn by time. Inside, elegant handwriting filled the pages, but it wasn't a published work. It looked like someone's private journal. Notes, reflections, dreams, fears, lessons learned through years of trial and error. He felt a strange intimacy reading the first few lines, as though touching the inner life of a stranger. A sentence near the middle of the page caught his eye. "No one will ever hand you the life you want. You must build it out of the pieces people overlook." The words tightened something in his chest. It echoed the message that had been haunting him all week. He carried the book to the counter. The old man looked surprised. "Ah, that one's been here for ages. Not many notice it." "Who wrote it?" he asked. "Unknown," the man replied with a gentle shrug. "Came from an estate sale decades ago. A person who wrote in private but never published. Some say the best writers are the ones whose names you'll never know." He hesitated. "How much is it?" The old man smiled, pushing the book back toward him. "Take it. Some books find their readers when they need them most." He opened his mouth to protest, but the man shook his head. "No, charge. Just promise you'll read it." He walked out of the shop with the journal pressed against his chest, feeling like he had been handed not a book but a quiet inheritance. As he walked home, wind tugging gently at his jacket, he thought about the unknown writer who had poured their soul into the pages, someone who had created without waiting for audience or permission, someone who had written because they needed to, not because the world demanded it. He wanted to be like that. Not invisible, but free. At home, he spent hours reading the journal, losing himself in the stranger's thoughts, their struggles, their triumphs, their quiet wisdom. Certain lines pierced him deeply. Fear grows in the spaces where action should live. And another, when you hesitate, you teach the world how to overlook you. He closed the journal slowly, feeling both seen and challenged. He set it beside his notebook and stared at them both for a long time. One represented the work of someone who never stopped writing. The other represented someone who had only just begun. And he realized something inevitable. He didn't want to stop anymore. He picked up his pen again, the weight of it grounding him, and opened his notebook to a fresh page. The blankness no longer felt intimidating. It felt like an invitation. He began writing. Not because he had something brilliant to say, but because he finally understood that brilliance wasn't the point. Motion was. Effort was. Showing up for his own life was. The hours drifted by, soft and steady, as he filled page after page with ideas, scenes, fragments of thought. His hand cramped, but he ignored it. He was building something, maybe a story, maybe a new version of himself. The sun slipped lower outside his window, painting the room in warm gold, and still he wrote. When exhaustion finally forced him to stop, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply, feeling peace in places that had known only tension for years. He checked his phone and realized he had missed a message from his manager. "We should talk Monday about your request." Normally, that would have sent him into a spiral of fear, overthinking every possibility. But tonight he felt strangely calm. Whatever the outcome, he had spoken up. He had stepped forward, and that alone made him feel like he had already begun to win. That evening he left the apartment again, needing fresh air. The streets were quieter now, the cold sharper, the sky a deep navy stitched with faint stars. He walked with no destination in mind, letting instinct guide him. Eventually he found himself near the river that cut through the city, its surface rippling under the glow of passing headlights. He leaned on the railing, watching reflections dance across the dark water. It reminded him of uncertainty, shifting, murky, but capable of revealing unexpected beauty if you looked long enough. As he stood there, a realization settled over him so gently he almost missed it. He was no longer waiting to feel ready. He was acting despite not being ready. That was the difference. That was the turning point. He stayed by the river until the cold drove him home, and even then he carried the quiet revelation with him like a lantern against the dark. When he finally returned to his apartment, he placed the anonymous journal beside his own notebook, the two touching at the corners as if acknowledging one another. He sat on the edge of his bed, removed the letter from his wallet, and smoothed the folds carefully. The ink had begun to lighten at the edges, but the message remained sharp. Your life is shrinking every year you refuse to live it. Stop waiting for permission to win. He whispered the words aloud, not as a plea this time, but as a vow. Sunday arrived with pale sunlight and the quiet promise of another day to move forward. He woke early again, brewed coffee, opened the journal from the antique shop, and reread several passages. Each line felt like a companion walking beside him, urging him not to turn back. He spent the morning writing, losing himself in the flow until his hand ached. At midday, he forced himself outside, unwilling to let the day pass in isolation. At a nearby community center, a flyer on the bulletin board caught his eye. Creative Writing Workshop, Beginner's Welcome. His heart lurched. Old fear rose quickly, instinctively urging him to step away before someone noticed him looking. But another voice, the newer one, the braver one, pushed back. He tore off one of the small tabs at the bottom of the flyer, the paper ripping unevenly between his fingers. The workshop started next week. That gave him time, not to prepare, but to accept that he would actually go. When he returned home, he set the torn flyer beside his notebook, forming a small constellation of objects that defined his new direction: the anonymous journal, the letter, the notebook, the flyer. Together they painted a quiet map of the person he was becoming. That night he didn't write as much, but he read deeply, letting the words of other writers fill the spaces his own courage had not yet touched. Eventually he fell asleep with a book still open beside him, the room dim, the air warm, the future shifting quietly into something he could finally imagine stepping toward. And when Monday morning arrived, he stood in front of the mirror again, straightened his collar, breathed deeply, and whispered the same vow he had repeated the night before. Not as fear, not as hope, but as intention. He whispered, "I am not waiting anymore." And for the first time in his life, the reflection staring back at him looked like someone who meant it. He felt the weight of Monday before the sun even rose, the kind of heaviness that used to crush him into stillness. But something in him shifted the moment he opened his eyes, a reminder of the vow whispered into the mirror the night before. The room was dim, the air quiet, yet he felt movement inside himself, a storm, gathering not to destroy him, but to break him open. As he dressed for work, doubt trailed closely behind him, whispering its familiar warnings that he was not enough, that the courage he had shown was temporary, that whatever waited for him today would expose him. But he didn't let those thoughts settle. He buttoned his shirt with steady hands, tied his shoes slowly, deliberately, reminding himself that the man walking out of the apartment today was not the man he had been last week, not even the man he had been yesterday. The world outside was wrapped in cold morning stillness, clouds hanging low like a second ceiling over the city. As he walked toward the bus stop, he felt the letter in his wallet press against his hip like a pulse, steady and insistent. The bus arrived with its usual hiss and clatter, doors folding open like a reluctant invitation. He stepped inside and sat near the window, watching as the city crawled awake. Buildings rose like silhouettes against the pale sky, windows flickering with early lights. Cars drifted through intersections. A cyclist pedaled past wearing a neon jacket that glowed in the gray morning. He should have felt anxious, he thought. Today, his manager wanted to talk. Normally, that word alone would have knocked the air out of his lungs, but he felt calm, or something close to it. A grounded unease instead of spiraling dread. Fear was still there, of course. It had lived inside him for so long it had become a quiet roommate, but it wasn't steering anymore. At the office, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow across muted carpet and cubicle walls. People shuffled in slowly, juggling coffee cups and yawns. He walked to his desk, powered on his computer, and felt the air shift when his manager approached. "Do you have a minute?" the man asked, tone clipped, unreadable. The old version of himself would have apologized first, then followed with stiff shoulders and lowered eyes. But today he simply nodded and stood, following his manager into a nearby meeting room. The door shut behind them with a soft click. His manager sat across from him, fingers laced together, expression somewhere between analytical and weary. "I thought a lot about your request," the man began. The sentence hung between them. His heart thudded once, hard, but he kept his expression steady. "I'll be direct," the manager continued. "You've been reliable, consistent, someone we trust. But stepping into a higher role requires more initiative, more visibility." Old shame pricked at him like needles. The manager continued, "Last week, I would have said no, but something's been different. You've been more engaged, more present, and frankly, I want to see if this is more than a phase." The man leaned back slightly. "So here's my offer. Take on a temporary leadership task. If you handle it well, the promotion becomes a real discussion, not just a possibility." The words hit him, harder than he expected. Not a yes. Not the dream answer, but not a denial either. It was a door cracked open, but open. "I can do that," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. His manager nodded once. "Good. Let's see what you're capable of." When the meeting ended, he walked back to his desk with a strange cocktail of emotions swirling inside him. Relief, fear, determination, disbelief. The task would be difficult. It would push him, but it was his. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint, unmistakable hum of possibility. Throughout the morning, he worked with deeper focus than he'd managed in a long time. He communicated with confidence he didn't fully feel. He contributed ideas that had been sitting dormant for years. His co-workers noticed, exchanging glances, offering small nods of acknowledgement. He felt every moment, every word, every breath sharpen him a little more. At lunch, he walked outside, needing air to cool the fire burning under his ribs. He found a quiet bench under a skeletal tree and pulled out the antique journal from Avery's shop. He flipped through the handwritten pages, stopping at a line he had underlined the night before. "Growth is not born from comfort. It is born from the friction between fear and action." He closed the book and stared at the sky. Clouds moved in slow formations, shifting shapes like thoughts drifting across the mind. He wondered about the unknown author, Someone who had written with conviction but never been read by the world. Someone who had created without applause, without permission. Their words had survived them. Their courage lived in ink, and somehow that courage had reached him. That afternoon, his manager called him over to a team meeting unexpectedly. "I want you to take lead on this one," the man said quietly. His pulse spiked. This was it. The test? He stepped forward, voice careful but steady, guiding the discussion with clarity he didn't know he possessed. He listened, he redirected, he focused, and though his hands trembled beneath the table, no one noticed. When the meeting ended, a coworker clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Nice work," she said genuinely. He had no words for the warmth that moved through him. Hours later, when the workday ended, he stayed behind to organize the next steps of his assignment. His co-workers trickled out one by one, offering good nights, until only the hum of the printer and the distant rattle of air vents remained. When he finally left the building, twilight had soaked the sky in purple and deep blue, streetlights flickering awake like watchful eyes. Instead of heading straight home, he walked toward the river again, drawn to the glow of reflections dancing across the dark water. The air was colder tonight, sharp enough to sting his cheeks, but he didn't mind. The cold kept him awake, alive, present. He leaned against the railing and watched the water move in restless currents. He felt like it mirrored him, conflicted, shifting, but unstoppable now that motion had begun. He took out the anonymous journal and flipped to the back page where he had left a small paper scrap the night before. The quote waiting for him there read, "If you want to change your life, begin by changing your posture toward the world. Stop bowing to what scares you." He inhaled deeply, letting the message settle in his chest. Behind him, a group of teenagers laughed as they walked by. A cyclist whizzed past. A dog barked in the distance. Life moved around him without waiting, without asking. And he finally understood that the world didn't pause for his fear. It never had. It never would. The real question was whether he was still willing to pause for his fear. Not anymore. As he walked home, streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. His breath formed thin white clouds. His thoughts felt like sparks scattering into the night. When he entered his apartment, he didn't turn on the lights. He liked the dimness, the way it softened the world, the way it allowed him to feel his emotions without the sharpness of visibility. He sat at his desk, opened his notebook, and wrote until the tension in his shoulders eased. Words spilled out of him, rough and unfiltered. He didn't care if they were good. He cared that they existed. He cared that he existed in them. When he finally stopped, his hand cramped. He leaned back and whispered into the quiet, "I'm beginning." And for the first time, he believed it. The next morning arrived with a quietness that felt almost ceremonial, a soft gray light settling over his apartment as though the world had decided to observe him instead of the other way around. He moved slowly at first, muscles still stiff from the restless night. But as soon as he reached for his notebook, the familiar flicker of purpose returned, small but potent. He wrote for nearly an hour before work, letting the words drip out in uneven rhythms, his mind still half dreaming yet focused enough to shape something meaningful. When he finally set the pen down, he felt steadier, more rooted. The day at the office unfolded differently this time, not easier, but clearer. He could see his co-workers watching him with newfound curiosity, noticing the shift in his posture, the confidence threading itself through his voice. His manager handed him files, tasks, decisions, not as tests now, but as responsibilities, real ones, with weight, and he accepted them without flinching. During lunch, he returned to the same bench beneath the skeletal tree. The wind rustled through its bare branches, carrying a faint chill. He opened the antique journal again and reread the lines he had highlighted, letting each word sink deeper into the spaces he used to guard with silence. He wondered whether the unknown writer ever doubted themselves the way he had, whether they ever hesitated, questioned, faltered. The ink on the pages said yes. The strength of the words said they push through anyway. That thought alone filled him with a strange, quiet courage that refused to leave. As the afternoon waned, he threw himself back into work with a sense of ownership he wasn't used to feeling. He made decisions without apologizing for them. He asked questions without shrinking. He listened with intention, not fear. And every moment carved another piece of the old version of himself away. When the workday finally ended, he felt exhausted but alive, like someone who had finally been allowed to breathe after years underwater. Instead of going home immediately, he walked to the small bookstore again, drawn back by instinct. The bell chimed softly when he entered, the warm scent of books greeting him like an old friend. The woman behind the counter recognized him and smiled. "Back again?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, something like that." "You seemed different last time," she said gently with a kind of intuitive knowing. "Lighter." He didn't know what to say to that. He simply smiled and wandered through the aisles, letting his fingertips trail along the shelves. He found a book on building creative habits, another on overcoming fear. He bought them both, not because he believed books alone could save him, but because he wanted to keep putting tools in his hands. On the way home, twilight settled over the city, the sky fading into soft shades of violet and navy. He walked slowly, breathing in the cool evening air, letting it settle deep into his lungs. When he reached his apartment, he brewed tea and opened one of the books from the shop, reading with quiet intensity. Hours passed unnoticed. The world outside dissolved into a distant hum, leaving only the turning of pages. Eventually, he forced himself to close the book and return to his notebook, writing until the words blurred. When he finally dropped onto his bed, exhaustion pulled him under almost instantly. But this time, sleep wasn't haunted. It was restful. He dreamed of rivers and bridges, of blank pages and open doors, of a version of himself standing firmly in the center of his life instead of pressed against the edges. For once, he woke before dawn, feeling ready. The rest of the week moved in a rhythm that felt new. Not smooth, but intentional. Every day he wrote. Every day he stepped into responsibilities that scared him. Every day he pushed back against the silence he had once mistaken for safety. His co-workers began to treat him differently, seeking his input, including him in conversations he once felt invisible during. His manager grew more direct, trusting him with tasks he never would have received before. And through it all, he carried the antique journal with him, using it as a compass, a reminder that he was not the first person to rebuild themselves from the inside out. Friday arrived faster than he expected, bringing with it an invitation he hadn't anticipated. One of his coworkers leaned over the cubicle wall and asked, "We're going out for dinner after work. You coming?" A simple invitation, a simple choice. But choices had weight now. Choices were the architecture of the life he was building. So he said yes. The restaurant was loud and warm, filled with clinking glasses and laughter. He felt awkward at first, unsure where to place himself in the chaos. But gradually, as conversations flowed and jokes slipped into the air, he felt something loosen in his chest. These people weren't judging him. They weren't measuring him. They were sharing space with him, offering him a seat at the table, not because he had asked for permission, but because he finally believed he deserved to be there. Later that night, walking home beneath street lights that flickered like quiet beacons, he realized something vital. The life he wanted wasn't waiting somewhere far away. It wasn't hidden behind a door someone else controlled. It wasn't dependent on success or recognition or perfection. It was here. In these choices, in these steps, in the courage to show up even when he didn't feel ready. The letter in his wallet no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a cornerstone, a promise, a command he had finally chosen to obey. When he reached his apartment, he stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing deeply, feeling the gravity of everything he had begun. And then with a steady hand, he whispered into the quiet, "I'm not done, not even close." For the first time in his life, those words felt true. He woke before sunrise on Saturday, the room still bathed in the bluish hush that sits between night and morning, and for a moment he lay completely still, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breath as a strange mix of anticipation and grief pressed against his ribs. He had expected progress to feel exhilarating, triumphant, maybe even simple once it finally began. But instead it felt like standing at the edge of a long, unfamiliar road with no assurance that the ground ahead would hold. The past week had changed him, subtly, steadily, undeniably, and yet he felt the weight of every step he had taken as if growth required the shedding of something he hadn't realized he still carried. He sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and the ache in his shoulders reminded him of all the hours he had poured into writing, thinking, rethinking, daring himself to move forward even when fear tried to drag him back. When he walked into the small kitchen and flicked on the light, it buzzed softly, illuminating the worn countertop, the chipped mug he favored, the stack of books he'd collected as if each one could teach him how to breathe differently. He made coffee with mechanical movements, but his mind churned with restless thoughts of what came next. Not in the dramatic sense of destiny or fate, but in the quiet, personal sense of responsibility. He had begun something now, something that could not be undone, something that demanded continuation. When he sat at the table and opened his notebook, the familiar pulse of anxiety rose in his throat, but it no longer controlled him. He flipped through the pages, each one filled with uneven lines and scattered ideas, and he realized that every page represented a version of himself, a man who had stopped running from his own voice. He turned to a fresh sheet and began writing. The words came slower today, like they were pushing through thick fog, but they came. He didn't worry about whether they were good. He focused on the act itself, on forging forward through discomfort, on honoring the promise he had made to himself the moment he stopped waiting for permission. After an hour, he finally set the pen down and rubbed his temples. The morning light had brightened, spilling through the blinds in thin stripes that cut across the table. He felt something shift again, an uneasiness, an unsettled stirring he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was something deeper, something older. A sense that he was approaching a wall he had avoided for years, a wall built not of hesitation but of pain. He closed the notebook gently and stood. The apartment felt too small suddenly, too quiet, too cramped with memories he had never taken the time to face. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but he welcomed it. He walked without direction, letting instinct guide him through streets washed in the pale gold of early morning. The city moved slowly around him, joggers passing with rhythmic breaths, dog walkers tugging at leashes, delivery trucks rumbling through intersections. Everything felt strangely distant, as if he were watching life through glass. He found himself wandering into a part of town he rarely visited, a quieter neighborhood with older houses, each one carrying the weight of stories he would never know. And then, without meaning to, he stopped in front of a small park, a familiar park, the one he used to visit with his father when he was a child. The sight of it hit him like a blow to the chest. He stood frozen at the entrance, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and throat. The swings rusted but still standing, the bench near the maple tree weathered and cracked. The patch of grass where he and his father used to kick a faded soccer ball back and forth. He hadn't been here in years, not since before everything fell apart. He stepped inside as though approaching sacred ground. The memories rose instantly, bright, warm, painful, jagged. His father's laugh, his father's encouragement, his father's disappointment, and then finally, his father's absence. He sat on the old bench, and the wood cold beneath him. He pressed his hands together and leaned forward, staring at the ground as the weight of unspoken history settled onto his shoulders. He had spent so long avoiding the past, convinced that burying it meant it no longer controlled him. But now, in the stillness of the park, he felt the truth like a bruise being pressed. He hadn't outgrown the pain. He had simply built his life around it. He remembered the day his father left. Not in explosive anger, not in violence, but in a silence so heavy it hollowed out every room in their home. His father had been a man who dreamed loudly but acted quietly, a man who talked about becoming more but never took the step he needed. And when life cornered him, he chose disappearance over disappointment, vanishing from their lives with a note that said nothing except that he was sorry. As a boy, he had blamed himself. As a teen, he had grown bitter. As an adult, he'd tried not to think about it at all, but the truth was unavoidable now. He had lived his life the same way his father had. Quietly, cautiously, apologetically, terrified of becoming a failure, terrified of becoming the reason someone else walked away. His father's absence had carved a wound so deep he never noticed how everything he did was shaped by trying not to repeat the same mistake. And in doing so, he had repeated an entirely different one. He had abandoned himself. He swallowed hard, emotion tightening in his throat. The park blurred slightly as memories spilled in, his father tying his shoelaces, teaching him to ride a bike, clapping from the sidelines during Little League games, then gradually pulling away, showing up less, speaking less, shrinking into a man who faded before he disappeared. He took a shaky breath and pressed his palm against his chest. The ache there felt old but alive, and maybe for the first time in his life, he didn't turn away from it. He faced it. "I'm not you," he whispered into the cold air, though the tremor in his voice betrayed how much he feared he was. He closed his eyes, letting the wind brush against his face, letting grief he had never acknowledged slip through the cracks he had been patching for decades. Silence settled around him. A heavy, cleansing silence. When he finally opened his eyes, the world looked sharper, not brighter, just clearer, as though he were seeing it without the filter of old wounds blurring the edges. He stood slowly, feeling the weight shift inside him, something releasing, something loosening. He walked further into the park, letting the memories follow but not consume him. Near the edge of the playground, he noticed a father helping his young daughter onto a swing. The girl giggled as he pushed her gently, her laughter echoing the laughter he once had. It struck him then, not with sadness, but with realization. Someone else's love didn't define him, and someone else's leaving didn't doom him. He was allowed to want. He was allowed to try. He was allowed to build a life not shaped by absence, but by intention. He pulled the letter from his wallet, the paper worn and softened by weeks of being carried. He stared at the message again, but this time the words hit differently, not as a command, but as an awakening. Your life is shrinking every year you refuse to live it. Stop waiting for permission to win. He folded it slowly, reverently, and placed it back into his wallet. Then, with a steadying breath, he stepped toward the path leading out of the park. As he walked away from the old playground, a quiet conviction began forming in the hollow of his chest, not loud, not triumphant, but steady and insistent, the way a small flame insists on burning even when the wind keeps trying to smother it. He followed the winding path through the park, past empty benches and leafless trees, past memories both warm and stinging, until he reached the street again. The city felt different now, not kinder, not safer, but somehow more welcoming, as if it had been waiting for him to show up fully before revealing its true shape. He headed toward downtown, letting the sounds of life gather around him. Car engines humming, snippets of conversations drifting, distant laughter rising from unseen corners. For the first time, none of it overwhelmed him. He felt connected to the movement, part of the rhythm rather than crushed beneath it. He stopped at a cafe he had never entered before, drawn by the warm light and the smell of baked bread drifting from inside. When he stepped in, the bell above the door chimed softly. A few people sat scattered across tables, some reading, some typing, some staring out the window with daydream-heavy eyes. He ordered a coffee and found a seat near the corner where he could watch the world without shrinking from it. As he sipped the drink, he opened his notebook again. But instead of writing his story, he found himself writing something different, a letter to his father. The words came hesitantly at first, stiff and awkward, but soon they began to flow, pulled forward by a lifetime of unsaid truths. He wrote about the hurt, the confusion, the anger. He wrote about the emptiness, the fear of becoming the same kind of man, the years he had spent trying to protect himself from repeating a story that was never his fault to begin with. And then slowly he wrote about forgiveness, not as a gift to his father, but as a release for himself. For too long he had carried the weight of a wound that wasn't his responsibility to heal. He didn't know if he believed in closure, didn't know if the act of writing would change anything, but when he finished the letter, he felt something inside him unclench. He folded the page carefully and tucked it into the back of his notebook, not to send it, not to share it, but simply to no longer carry its contents alone. He stayed in the cafe for nearly an hour, letting the warmth seep into him, letting the noise around him soften the edges of the past. When he finally stood to leave, the heaviness in his chest felt lighter, still present, but no longer suffocating. Outside, the sky had brightened into a clear midday blue. He walked aimlessly, feeling the ground beneath him with rare awareness, grateful for the simple sensation of forward motion. Without thinking, he found himself heading toward the bookstore, the same one where he had first read his writing aloud. The bell chimed as he entered, and the familiar scent of paper greeted him like an embrace. The woman behind the counter recognized him and smiled warmly. "Hello again," she said. "Back for more inspiration?" He nodded. Something like that. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with quiet curiosity. "You seem different," she said. "Lighter than last time. More you?" Her words struck deeper than she probably intended. He thanked her, then wandered through the aisles, feeling an unexpected comfort in the narrow spaces between shelves. He ran his hand over the spines of books until one caught his attention, not because of its cover, but because it was slightly out of place, pushed forward more than the others. He slid it from the shelf and opened it. Inside, on the first page, someone had written in faded ink, "Write bravely, live bravely, everything else follows." He didn't know why, but the message sent a quiet shiver through him. Maybe it was the simplicity, the directness, the echo of everything he had been learning. Maybe it was the way it felt like the universe kept whispering versions of the same truth from different angles. He bought the book and left the shop with it tucked under his arm like a companion. The afternoon continued in a slow drift as he walked home, letting the city fold around him. When he reached his apartment, he placed the new book beside his notebook and the antique journal, forming a small, meaningful collection. His desk had become a reflection of his inner world, messy, brave, unfinished, growing. He spent the rest of the afternoon writing, not just stories, but reflections, memories, goals, anything that surfaced. He no longer tried to force his words into neat shapes. He let them spill naturally, trusting that clarity would come with effort, not hesitation. As evening descended and shadows stretched across the walls, he closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. His body ached from the hours of writing, but the ache felt good, earned, purposeful, deserved. He walked to the window and looked out at the glowing city, each light a reminder that life pulsed in a million directions at once. For so long he had believed that other people had something he didn't: luck, talent, opportunity, confidence. But now he understood something simpler, something quieter. The difference wasn't what they had. It was what they were willing to reach for. He pressed his palm against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath his hand, and whispered softly to himself, "I'm still learning. That's enough." The city lights flickered in response, or maybe they didn't. But in that moment, he felt aligned with something larger than the limits he had once imposed on himself. He stepped away from the window, turned off the lights, and let the darkness settle gently around him. It wasn't threatening anymore. It felt like a beginning. A place where new things could grow. He woke on Sunday with the kind of clarity that didn't feel loud or triumphant, but quiet and steady, like a river settling into its natural course after years of being dammed by fear. And for a long moment he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, breathing in the stillness that filled the room. He felt different, not finished, not transformed, but undeniably shifted, as though something inside him had rearranged itself during the night without asking permission or waiting for the right moment. He rose slowly, letting his feet touch the cold floor, grounding himself in the present moment. As he made coffee, he felt the familiar hum of anxiety flicker through him, but instead of tightening around his ribs, it drifted like harmless static in the background. Today mattered. Not because something dramatic was about to happen, but because everything he had been building toward was beginning to take shape in ways he could no longer ignore. He opened his notebook at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages he had filled over the past weeks, and for the first time he didn't see chaos or doubt. He saw effort, growth, determination stitched through each uneven line. He picked up his pen to write, but before the tip touched paper, his phone buzzed. A message from his coworker appeared on the screen. "You did great this week. Seriously, haven't seen you like that before." The praise felt strange, almost foreign, yet warm in a way that loosened something knotted inside him. He typed a small thank you, hesitated, then deleted it, and wrote a more honest response. "Thank you. I'm trying means a lot." And it did. More than he expected. He returned to his notebook and began writing, letting the words flow without judgment, trusting the process rather than fearing the imperfections. After an hour, he closed the notebook gently, feeling a sense of completion settle over him. Not the completion of a journey, but of a chapter. The sun had risen higher now, spilling warm light across the room. He stepped outside into the chilly morning, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as he walked toward the river, drawn back to the quiet place where his thoughts seemed to arrange themselves more clearly. The water moved in slow, deliberate currents, reflecting patches of sky between ripples. He leaned on the railing, letting the cold metal press into his palms. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge just how far he had come. Not in accomplishments, not in titles or achievements, but in courage. Courage measured not by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to face it. He pulled the worn letter from his wallet, unfolding it carefully. The ink had faded even more now, but the message still struck him with the same force it had the day he first read it. Your life is shrinking every year you refuse to live it. Stop waiting for permission to win. He mouthed the words silently, tasting their truth. They no longer felt like a reprimand. They felt like a promise. He folded the letter again and slipped it back into his wallet with a reverence he hadn't felt before. As he stood there, a soft breeze brushed against his face, cool and cleansing, almost as if the world were nodding in quiet acknowledgement. He pushed himself away from the railing and walked along the river path, passing joggers and dog walkers and people lost in their own complicated lives. He wasn't separate from them anymore. He wasn't hidden. He was part of the world again, imperfect, uncertain, but present. That was enough. Eventually, he turned back toward home, moving with a sense of purpose he couldn't have named months ago. When he reached his apartment, he set his notebook on the desk and placed the anonymous journal beside it. The two books touched at the corners like anchors holding him steady. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the small collection of things that had helped rebuild him. Then, with a slow breath, he whispered to the empty room, "I'm ready for whatever comes next." And he meant it, not as a declaration, but as acceptance. Readiness wasn't a feeling, it was a choice, a decision to face the unknown rather than run from it. He sat down at his desk, opened his notebook again, and allowed himself to simply breathe, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket rather than a cage, feeling the unfamiliar comfort of being alone without being lonely. For years he had mistaken isolation for safety and hesitation for wisdom, but now, sitting in the soft afternoon light, he understood something painfully simple. Life had never asked him to be fearless, only honest. Honest about what he wanted, what he feared, what he was capable of. Honest enough to move anyway. He picked up the pen and wrote one more line. Not a story, not a reflection, not a letter to the past, but a promise to the future. I will not disappear from my own life again. The words trembled on the page, unsure but sincere. He closed the notebook gently, letting the ink dry. Outside, the world continued without pause. Cars humming down the street, voices drifting from passing sidewalks, birds calling from rooftop edges, and instead of feeling behind, he felt aligned, part of the motion rather than chasing it. He brewed tea and stood by the window, watching the late afternoon sun stretch long shadows across the buildings. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who hid, who apologized for existing, who waited for a sign that never came. He didn't despise that version of himself. He understood him. He forgave him. Fear had shaped him, yes, but fear had also kept him alive long enough to grow beyond it. He took a slow sip of tea, savoring the warmth spreading through his chest. The world wasn't easier now, nor was he suddenly braver, wiser, or stronger. But he was, learning to stand, to speak, to reach, and that was enough to begin rewriting the rhythms of his life. Evening settled in gradually, painting the sky in dim purples and soft blues. He turned on a lamp and let the warm glow fill the room. The gentle light made the space feel lived in, real, like a place being rebuilt piece by piece. He sat on the floor beside his bed, leaning against the frame, letting his body relax into the carpet. The weight of the day, the week, the entire journey pressed against him in waves, not crushing, but grounding. Every moment that had once felt insignificant now carried meaning. Every step, even the smallest ones, connected. His breath deepened, steady and sure as he let the truth settle inside him. He was not waiting for permission anymore, not to write, not to speak, not to live. He closed his eyes, allowing the quiet to fill him. For the first time in his life, silence wasn't empty, it was full of possibility, and somewhere deep within that silence, he felt the spark of a future he had once been too afraid to imagine, a future he was finally ready to walk toward, step by uncertain step, without apology, without hesitation, and without shrinking from the person he was becoming. When he finally rose from the floor and turned off the lamp, the darkness didn't frighten him. It felt like a beginning.